Um, I am excited to be here talking to you about education systems and related policies tonight. I'm Danny Gervon. I am Associate Professor and Program Director for the School Psychology Program at CMU. I've seen I've seen y'all at face-to-face meetings, and so this is kind of my bread and butter, talking about schools, talking about education systems. Really important system for kids with neurodevelopmental disabilities. And so I'm excited to hear from you all on this tonight. So I want to get us warmed up. So in the chat, I want you to think about what your favorite city is to visit. So I was getting ready for our module from Boston last week. It was so nice to be at a conference again in person. And so I'm just curious to hear what your favorite city to visit is. My favorite convention city is by far New Orleans, Louisiana, because it's right on the edge of the French Quarter. And so I love that. And then in 5 words or less, what has been your favorite aspect of the Miland experience so far? So curious to hear from y'all. Awesome. Couple small northern Michigan towns. I like that. Petoskey, Traverse City coming through. Nashville. Interdisciplinary collaboration. That's not a city, Allison. I'm just kidding. Awesome. Yeah, some great cities on here. Many of these I've been to for conventions, actually. Chicago, Denver. Denver's a good city for a convention. They got a good convention center. Awesome. And then, yeah, great reflections on your favorite aspect of Miland so far. I think my favorite aspect too has been kind of learning from the other disciplines, as I get so like siloed in psychology and even school psychology specifically. It's nice to hear from folks who are, speech language pathologists or in pediatrics and different things. So, well, this is great. I appreciate all of this. Thanks. All right. So here's how I have the Zoom meeting structured for tonight. So I want to do a little bit of overview on what's in Canvas for the resources and for the mandatory clinical experience. Then I've got 3 discussion questions that I'll pose to the group, and we'll handle those in a large group setting. And last year, they're really interesting, I think, discussion questions. And last year we spent too much time on them, and then I didn't have enough time for the activity. So I really want to spend most of our time on the activity tonight, which is actually diving into an individualized education program, looking at the document. I'll orient you to the document if you've never seen one before. And then we'll kind of go through and critique it, apply some of those quality indicators that were in the Iris Center module with respect to PLAF statements and goals and objectives and statements of services. So there will be some different elements to that. I'll orient you to the document, then we'll break you out into small groups where you can kind of talk through critique. And then we'll kind of bring it back to the large group to share some kind of final reflections, and then we will wrap it up from there. Okay, I'm not ready for that yet. So talking about what's in Canvas. So there's a whole bunch of resources in there. So one of those is a very amateur-made PowerPoint by me, where I give an overview of IDEA and Section 504 and some of its major provisions, and some of the major facets and elements of those really important pieces of legislation. There's a website, so the National Center for Education Statistics talks about statistics on students with disabilities. That's kind of just handy to know about. They update, there's a little lag time on that. I think they're 2 or 3 academic years behind oftentimes. That gives you an idea. So about 13% of public school kids are served under IDEA. It gives you an idea of like what the most common disabling conditions are. So we know the most common is specific learning disability, speech language impairment. We can kind of see where autism and intellectual disability fall within that. So there's some nice figures and graphs in there. And they have that disaggregated by race, ethnicity, which is nice as well. There's a resource in there about the purpose and history of IDEA, which I also covered in the YouTube video that's posted that I did. Then I've got, I recommended that you bookmark Michigan's DOE page on laws, regulations, and policies. There's some really good documents in there that you might need in your clinical work at some point in your career. So some things in there include Michigan's policy on the emergency use of seclusion and physical restraint, which schools sometimes have some problems with. And so if you are working with kids who are in schools and they seem to be overusing seclusion and restraint, you should go look at that document and figure out the conditions under which it can be used. So that's on that website. And then there's guidance for like extended school year services. So some of our kids need special education services during the summer. That can only happen under certain conditions. And so there's some documentation on there for that. There's all kinds of handy stuff on there that you might need at some point in your clinical work. So then the big, huge document are the MARS rules. So those are Michigan Administrative Rules for Special Education. That really is how special ed law gets implemented in the state of Michigan. And so within that, there's definitions of a whole bunch of terms. The criteria for the different disabilities that you can qualify under in Michigan. So what are the criteria for autism spectrum disorder, for cognitive impairment, for specific learning disability, and they're all very much laid out in there. And then there's timelines and what is an IEP and what is an IEE, what happens when parents disagree with the school's decisions. And so that's all laid out within the MARS rules. And then you all looked at an IRIS Center module. I love the IRIS Center. I assign IRIS Center stuff kind of all the time in the course I teach on assessment and intervention for developmental disabilities. So that's out of Vanderbilt University, which has one of the premier special education departments in the nation. And it's a wonderful website. There's so much on there that's probably relevant to your work. And so we looked at one module on developing high quality IEPs. So I wanted to give that quick overview. And if folks have any questions, do y'all have questions about any of that? Okay, I'm just checking the chat as well. Okay, so those are the resources. Hopefully you got a chance to sift through those. If not, definitely do that. There's really useful, handy stuff in there. Okay, so then the other part that's on Canvas is the mandatory clinical experience. That's part of this module, which basically has you reading one of your clients' IEPs or individualized family service plans if they're very young. And if you don't have access to a client IEP or IFSP, there is an example one that is posted there that you can critique. And so that mandatory clinical experience has you submitting a 2 or 3 page reflection, addressing the strengths and weaknesses of that document in light of that IRIS Center resource that you all look through. It also has you explain similarities and differences in what you might recommend for clinical care in however you write treatment plans within your discipline, and then kind of an overall reflection on what you've learned. So that assignment is not due for this module, right? The due date for that is the end of your Myland experience, which I think, is like May 31st. So that's that. And I'm happy to work with you and answer any questions about that. Just shoot me an email and we can talk through documents. I don't want to see any documents. I don't want to see any identifying information or anything like that. But if you have questions about how to critique that document, I'm happy to work with you on that. Although we're going to practice that tonight too. Okay, so this is the stuff that I have for kind of large group discussion. And so this is stuff that I want to hear from you all about. So I have kind of three questions to pose to you. And we'll start with this one. So the educational system is critically important in the lives of children with neurodevelopmental disabilities, right? They're spending 7 hours a day there. They're there for 180 days for the school year. I don't think there's a system where kids are spending, a system outside of the home where kids are spending more time once they're school age. So I'm curious to hear from folks. And so I want you to pop off pop off mute and kind of chime in. I'm curious how your role intersects with the education system, because I know I don't think there's a lot of school-based practitioners in this group. So I'm kind of curious how you do encounter schools for the clients that you're working with.
So I'm a PEDS resident, and so oftentimes it's either explaining what these documents are when I'm suggesting that parents go seek them out for their child. So what if I have a floor plan and IPR, or asking them to bring them in so I can kind of, if a kid is still struggling, and it seems like, in my opinion, we've kind of optimized therapy or meds for maybe ADHD, but maybe check to make sure those accommodations at school are enough or appropriate. So that's usually like the two main ways I interact with education.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So on one hand, helping parents seek those services, and on the other hand, evaluating whether they seem appropriate based on diagnosis and kind of strengths and difficulties the child's having. Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Other folks?
So I'm go for it. Who was that? I can't see who's talking. Everyone's disappeared.
Can't either. So this is Kat. So I work for actually a small ABA clinic, and the surrounding schools for a lot of our kiddos, we co-collaborate with their special education teachers. We've gone in there to observe, to see what behaviors are not generalizing from our center to theirs and vice versa. So we also give some kind of that parent training feel when they come to observe. So that way, if there's anything that what is being successful with us, they're able to help take advantage of translating it to their classroom if possible. We also talk about different goals to help with that transition to make it easier, because we're early intervention.
Mm-hmm. I love that idea of collaborating on generalization across the two settings. How's that gone for you?
Actually pretty well, as one of our schools have done. We have a little bit better relationship because actually one of their special ed teachers is doing their master's in ABA. I apologize, I have a dog right now that's squeaking her toy.
It's all good.
But she's been doing her clinic, her field supervision work within our clinic during the summer. Okay. And so we've gotten a lot of training from her about like the IEPs, and she's been able to bring some of the practices into our classroom. One thing we do try to do a lot is bringing, if something is not generalizing, taking those small things from what the desk or what am I thinking of? I know Ada knows this. But those commonalities to help create that same environment.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thanks for sharing. Ada, I think you're going to say something.
Yeah, actually, just like Kat, I'm also an ABA, but I'm working towards my BCBA. I'm currently an assistant behavior analyst, but our clinic does specifically school-based services as well as home-based services and other things. So my master's thesis is currently based around kids who are eligible for an FBA within the school, and we're adding a new component to an FBA to see if it'll even work. So we'll go in and actually work with children in their classroom and train their teachers specifically on how to better make the environment supportive of that child and find out why they're engaging in problem behaviors. We usually go for the really severe ones who can't be in a classroom with other kids. One of my current clients has like literally an hour and a half a day of class right now because of the behaviors they're engaging in, and we're working on getting them up to their full day. So that's kind of bringing everything from LEND into working with those families has really been really fantastic, because I work with adults with more psychiatric illness. So this is very new. It's a completely different population, very different and unique issues. So
yeah.
Yeah.
But it sounds like pretty direct work. You're out there in the schools, and so yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Anyone else like to share on this one?
So I wrote something in the chat, and I don't know if anybody else is in the
Oh,
same boat as me. But I do not directly work with children in a clinical setting, and I have never have. I used to do foster care, but those are more so for teens, and it was a refugee foster care program. So the priority was their citizenship status. Um, and I work a lot with adults with IDD, and I'm a sibling, but never working directly with children with an IEP. Um, like supporting family members, yes, but I've never like sat in on one of those meetings. Um, and so I'm wondering if there's any advice for us.
yeah, that's a good question. I think in any of your roles, I think it's nice to know about what rights children have under special education law and what rights their parents have. And I think being familiar with some of the procedural safeguards that go into IDEA and Section 504 are important because sometimes children's and families' rights are violated by schools, and it could be with things like related to school-based discipline. Unfortunately, kids with disabilities are suspension and expulsion is used way more often than it probably needs to be. And kids who do have IEPs or 504 plans have certain specific rights with respect to discipline. Parents have numerous rights that are outlined in those procedural safeguards documents as to like when meetings are scheduled, if they disagree with the school's evaluation or the IEP, what avenues for recourse that they have. And so I think familiarizing yourself with some of that could be helpful, even if you are in a very indirect role for kids in schools. I think that's probably my biggest piece of advice. I mean, these laws are in place to protect kids and to protect families. So I would say that's the biggest piece of advice I'd give.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to this one. Well, it's sort of related to what I was saying, but so parental participation is a huge deal with special education law. But despite that, there can be some pretty significant barriers to promoting authentic partnerships between families of children with NDDs and school personnel. In your experiences with the educational system, have you seen some barriers to those partnerships? And if so, what were they? And then, have you seen these partnerships work really effectively? And in that situation, what strategies were people using? I guess let's break it down. Let's start with barriers. What barriers to authentic partnerships have you seen in schools?
So I don't know if these are sometimes what is actually happening or if parents aren't always understanding what the school is telling them. But I feel a lot of times, especially with COVID, they've been told like different things about the timing of the evaluation process is okay to be delayed kind of due to like less resources during COVID. And sometimes I think it's the parents not understanding, and sometimes I think it may be a little bit of the school maybe pushing back a little bit, and that goes the same in terms of whether they can evaluate like a student for dyslexia. So I feel like communication is one of the biggest barriers, and like the different legalese of these rules and laws and what's expected, and parents sometimes limited understanding of what their rights and things are.
Yeah, I think that's huge. Well, you kind of said a lot that I think, and even outside the scope of COVID, that are barriers, and one is challenges with communication. So yes, I think it's incumbent on the schools to inform the parents of their rights, and what that looks like really varies from place to place, I think. So as a school-based practitioner, I would always try to sit down and go through that procedural safeguards document with my parents so that they really understood You know, anytime we make a change, you have to receive prior written notice. You have to consent to this and this. If the student racks up 10 days of suspension, this and this and this are going to happen. If you disagree with the school, this is going to happen. And so I think sometimes schools, you know, and school practitioners are so busy, right? And school working in schools the last couple of years has been incredibly challenging. But yeah, the communication piece is a big deal. Parents maybe not understanding what their rights are and not being fully informed on what their rights are has been a big deal. Yeah, other barriers that y'all have noticed?
I think,
Oh, sorry, Adam. I think systematically there's some structures that lead to mistrust. You know, some of that as far as if the funding is not there, then schools are in a position where they feel like they can't offer some services that legally they really should be offering. And so they're trying to figure out how to, you know, meet the law, but yet meet their, you know, financial expectations. But then, and other things, like one of the biggest challenges is parents work during the day. And so, but meetings are during the day. And technically meetings should be when the parents are available, and yet teachers and workers are under contract with unions that don't necessarily provide the freedom for them to do that, or their schedules don't provide that freedom. So it's almost as if a couple of the structures are set up to, you know, be in conflict, and it's going to be a barrier no matter what we want to do.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Amy. With the scheduling bit, you know, teachers are on contract 7:30 to 3:30 or something like that. And, you know, if parents are working, it's often, you know, they often have to take time off of work, or yeah, those structural elements do cause some challenges, and the funding is a whole different thing that causes some issues too. That's a piece of the law that I don't know as much about, but you know, because we're often focused most on like clinical care with this one kid right here, and but certainly those structural elements, you're right to point those out. I think they do cause some challenges for well-functioning teams. So thanks for mentioning those. Someone else was chiming in too, I think.
Oh yeah, I was just going to mention about one of the barriers I've noticed, kind of going off the communication part. I sat in on an IEP for a student with autism who, you know, he did have a lot of behavioral challenges, and actually the IEP was pretty well written, but and it had a lot of stipulations, like if the student was kind of had sensory overload, he had certain safe spots where you go to cool down, or he was not to be touched, or all this. It's pretty well detailed, but the problem is almost the staff of the school was not in service or whatever. So it created huge problems. And the whole reason we kind of found out about it, his mom was a teacher's aide in the same school. So she really observed it. And then we had a huge problem of, yeah, we have this really nice document, but it's not being followed by anyone except for maybe the special education teacher. And then, because even, you know, if the security guards perhaps saw him in the lunchroom by himself, he might be not aggressive, but get back to class, or maybe put his hand on him, just not even realizing that that's going to set him off. And then it looks like he was doing the right thing because he had the right to go cool down, but now he got more agitated, and now looks to be aggressive. So.
Yeah, that raises an important issue, right? Like you said, you can have an IEP document that checks all of the quality indicators in that Iris Center module, right? But that's one piece of the puzzle. But getting that implemented is another piece, and everyone who interacts with the student needs to know what that student's services are, right? And what their accommodations and modifications are. And that needs to get communicated out beyond just the IEP team, because that security guard's not going to be in that IEP meeting, right? But they're going to interact with that kid. So they need to know about those accommodations and behavioral strategies and such. So yeah, that's another issue that can be a problem and lead to some more mistrust between families and school personnel if we're not implementing an IEP. An IEP is like a contract, y'all. Like it has to be implemented. It has to be. And so, yeah, that's tricky. Well, let's flip it though. What have you noticed work well in schools? What strategies have you seen used that have fostered really solid partnerships?
As a family member, I observed that um, working well with blended families has helped a lot. So making sure that everybody on each part, so the parents as well as if there are significant others who are support people, like that everyone is aware and being comfortable working and meeting with everybody, of course, with the right, I guess, paperwork to sign. Um, I have observed that to be really helpful.
So you're saying kind of sort of like all relevant people who have specialized knowledge of the kids are
Yep.
are invited.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
I think another thing is, well, there's two things. One is time. So, like, actually taking the time to listen to families and, like, hear about their concerns and their ideas and all those things. And then, kind of related to that, like, empowering families as a member of, like, the team because they're supposed to be a member of the team. That's what all the, like, legal stuff says, right? But sometimes parents don't necessarily know that or don't necessarily feel that way. But if we can kind of make some explicit statements about that, like telling them that they're the expert in their child and those kinds of things can be really helpful in trying to kind of build up a solid relationship with the family that's hopefully going to help promote better outcomes.
Yeah, I like that. When you're working through that IEP planning process, kind of soliciting their input as you move along is a really solid strategy. So thanks for sharing that. A couple other things that I'll just mention quick is the scheduling bit, right? We do have to try to schedule meetings when parents can attend. So we've got to deal with their work schedules and transportation issues and lack of childcare. Those are some real world things that affect parents' abilities to take part in IEP meetings. And school personnel should try to account for some of that and respond to some of that. And I'm wondering too, like when I was practicing, sometimes parents were able to attend through phone, but now we have good video conferencing. And so I think video conferencing could potentially help address some of those barriers too. I know a lot of schools, they were exclusively doing video conferencing, but I imagine many have continued, to where we are now. We need to make sure that interpreters are present, for our families who don't speak English fluently. We need to try to avoid educational jargon and acronyms, which special ed law is full of this stuff, which you probably got a little flavor of from the documents you looked at. But we've got to be careful about that. Really try to synthesize what the purpose of what we were doing at each step of the IEP planning process. Because we'd be talking about PLAFs and LRE and FAPE and IDEA and SLD and ASD, and that's very confusing to families. So, and then again, I'll reiterate this part, but we've got to fully inform parents of what their rights are. Those procedural safeguards documents, y'all, are a slog. Like, that's hard to read with an advanced degree, right? Like, we've got to interpret that for our parents. And so I really do encourage you to read those and try to help your parents understand what some of that means. But I think all of that can help foster better partnerships with the families. Okay, I'm getting a little behind. I wanted to be further by now, but okay, last question. And this is a lot of text, but basically this gets to this. So FAPE, free appropriate public education. So I talked a little bit about that in the YouTube video that you watched. This is school's responsibility to provide FAPE or free appropriate public education. There's been a lot of debate though, like people understand what free means and what public education means, but people disagree about what appropriate means. And when you look at the legal challenges in the special ed realm, it's clear that appropriate does not mean maximally beneficial. And that's hard for some of us. That's hard for me. I got an ethics code, and many of you have ethics codes that promote best practices. Best practices is not appropriate practice. So how do we reconcile some of this stuff? I think is my question. And so have you ever encountered this in your practice, or, working with kids who are in the education system? Have you felt that the school is doing something that's quote unquote appropriate, but you want to do more? And so I don't know if people have stories about this or want to share anything here. And if you haven't, like, what could you anticipate, basically?
So we have one of our current cases. This is less on the education, on more on just how they handle the child in general. It's they have a very strict no restraint policy at the school. However, this child is notorious for sprinting out of the building and running down the street. And the police end up being called, and it is a huge deal. And we're currently at the point where we're trying to work on keeping the child in school, but when there's no barriers to keeping the child in the building and they just step aside and let the child run, that's like that point, that's their definition of appropriate, that it would be inappropriate to put hands on this child. And for our practices at the ABA clinic that we work at, we would recommend using like handle with care to keep the child safe. So when they come to us for, it's like, well, what could we have done differently? It's like, well, we're not going to change policy in your specific classroom. There's nothing we can do at this point. This will continue to happen because the function is still very, very functional for that child. I'm not sure if that's quite it, but that was something that was definitely sort of an issue with what's appropriate, what's not. And at this point, like we can't do too much more with the BIP that we've developed because of that specifically. Yeah,
I'm trying to formulate some thoughts around that. That's interesting, because you might argue that what the school's doing is not appropriate, or
they're pretty fervent on their decision to not, because they've used different forms of restraint that are not as effective as like handle with care. But it's just like, what is beneficial to this child? Is it beneficial to call the police on this child who doesn't know how to handle, a child with disability who's not dangerous, but is in danger right now? So it's just caused so many issues for the kid.
And arguably could be a more dangerous situation with police interactions and such.
Yes. 100%. So it's just between a rock and a hard place, really. Like there's no good answer. Like we can't come up with any good answers really for what to do. So, but that's the definition of appropriate. No one knows.
Very challenging. Yeah. I think that fits with what's kind of here on the slide. Other folks?
I have a patient that I worked with who she's like in middle school, and she was diagnosed with autism, but is I don't like to use the term high functioning. I don't even think that's like the right way to describe it, but she's conversational. She uses language appropriately, but the social challenges are apparent, and they're especially apparent between her and her teacher. And her mom has pursued an IEP multiple times, but because she is academically doing well in school, she's not eligible, even though she has a diagnosis of autism. She doesn't have an educational diagnosis of autism. And so she's getting an appropriate education, but there I think are behavioral components to her experience of school, including her social interactions and the importance of educators and other teachers in the class to be aware of her diagnosis, because it impacts her interaction with them. And she's instead instead of understanding her diagnosis of autism, she's being labeled as like defiant or like she demonstrates work refusal, and these things end up reflecting on her academic performance. So this is where I feel like she's, she doesn't have an IEP. She doesn't have an IEP, and she's getting an appropriate education. I think that there's more things that the school could be doing for her.
You didn't get me fired up. So it's not quite where I'm going with the question, because these would be kids who do qualify, who don't receive the level of service that you think is needed, but this is sort of a corollary. And I will point you to the Mars rules where it outlines the criteria for ASD. They talk about adverse educational impact, and the ASD needs to cause adverse educational impact. And they explicitly define that as more than academics. They talk about behavioral impact and they talk about social impact. And so it never made sense to me. Anyways, I'm kind of like going on a soapbox a little bit, but it never made sense to me where, like a kid wouldn't qualify for school-based services because ASD within it has social challenges. And it seems like those would translate to adverse educational impact in the social realm. Of course, the school-based teams, they have to make their decision. It's a multidisciplinary evaluation team, and that's who makes the call. But sometimes we have too narrow of an interpretation on what adverse educational impact means, especially in the realm of ASD, where they explicitly point out that you have to consider more than academics. But anyways, that's a different sort of thing. But yeah, I know that's quite frustrating. And yeah, I'll leave that alone now. But Amy, you got your hand up.
Well, next to what Crystal has said is because my discipline is education. And so one of the times when I really find myself questioning some of the ethical and professional standards is around those kinds of situations where I have students who have dyslexia or ADHD or autism, and they've been evaluated for special education services. And the whole conversation is they're doing okay enough academically, so they are not going to qualify for services. However, if you're looking at it, you have to look at academic and behavioral and management needs. So it's more than just academic grades. And so it becomes, that tends to be when those ethical pieces get really stretched for me, because I'm like, oh, this is not appropriate. We already know, or ADHD, especially, like if they're making these impulsive decisions and they can't manage anything, like it is impacting their education. Their grades are going down because they're not turning things in. But that's not, just that concept of adverse impact and the gray areas there, that you can't define it to be real pinpointed, but it still needs to be, it's the intent of the law and it needs to be considered.
Yeah, great points. And I would just encourage us all to be thinking about adverse educational impact as broad and beyond grades and beyond standardized test scores, and thinking about behavioral realm, social realm. And academics, of course, too. I mean, that's a primary function of schools, right? But we've got to think about that piece broadly. So I'm going to move us along. This is great, though. We could talk about this stuff all night, I think. But let's move along. So I want to do an activity, and I got to pop out of this PowerPoint for a sec. I need to share a couple links with y'all. Actually, I'm going to share this. It's hard to find example IEPs. So I scoured the internet for quite a while trying to find redacted stuff. And so I found this. This is the state of Washington. So I just dropped a link in the chat for this redacted IEP. They have several examples on the state of Washington's one of their DOE websites, but this may be the first time you've seen an IEP. And if that's the case, I'm going to spend a little bit of time orienting you to this, and then I'm going to break us out into groups. And we're going to try to critique it based on some of those quality indicators that were discussed in the Iris Center module with respect to PLAF statements, with respect to goals, and with respect to statements of services. So this is an IEP, and I think I'm sharing it, right? That's on Chrome. Okay. So this is a 12th grade student, 19-year-old with intellectual disability. And every state's IEPs look different. Every districts within states IEP can look different. Different districts use different like online management systems. There's some out there that are pretty common, like Easy IEP, I think is a pretty common one in Michigan. When I practiced in the state of Texas, we use something called Encore. There's a whole bunch of them out there. And this one's kind of old school. They got some handwritten stuff in here. You don't see that very often anymore. And this is from 2013. So I don't know. I guess some people maybe handwrite their IEP still. Anyways, you're going to get a like sort of demographic page. But what I want to focus on is, okay, so there's also a transition plan. So the federal law says once you turn age 16, you need to have a transition plan in place that talks about what happens after high school. Some states do it earlier. And so that's what this is. This is not a big, what I want to focus on though. So there's a couple of pages of transition plan. And then what I want to look at is this page. So this is, we'll look at this one. This one is math. Okay, so IEPs are very logical, okay? At least they should be. Sometimes they're not. So the idea is that you use assessment data to drive something called a PLAF statement. A PLAF statement is a present levels of academic achievement or functional performance. This is like where you're starting in a certain area. This is your baseline level of performance. This is what you're going to build the next year of services on, okay? So that's a PLAF statement. So on this page, there's a PLAF statement and it's right here. It says present levels. Okay, so this student's able to make coin exchanges in a variety of ways up to $10 with 60% accuracy and 4 prompts. Okay, that's a present level statement. Within this, there's also an impact statement. Okay, so that impact statement's talking about how that makes it difficult to make progress in, general education kind of stuff. Okay, so present levels, that's your baseline level of performance. Your assessment drives your PLAFs, okay? From your PLAFs, you build out a goal, okay? You build out an annual goal. So IEPs are written for a calendar year, okay? So, so here's the goal. It's actually on the same page. Okay, so this student will improve their ability to make coin exchanges in a variety of ways up to $10 from 60% to 80% accuracy with no more than 2 prompts. Okay, so that's the goal. And that's what they're setting out for that annual year. Okay, so you're going to write a PLAF statement and you're going to write a goal for, you have to prioritize sometimes. So a lot of kids we work with, they have a lot of different needs, right? But in an IEP, you're not going to write a PLAF and a goal for, 100 different things. Usually in an IEP, you will see anywhere between, 1 goal, but maybe up to 8, 9, 10 goals in some cases. So it's going to be prioritized, and this is really broken out to the academic areas. There was one behavior goal, but there's a math, there's a reading, and there's a writing. And I believe that's all that's in this example. So each one of those areas has a PLAF statement and has a goal. So after the teams consider the PLAFs and goals, they have to decide what services are needed to meet those goals. Okay, this happens in a very specific order. Schools don't always do this, but it should happen in this order: assessment, PLAFs, goals, services. Okay, this is kind of out of order. The services actually come before all this stuff. Within this particular example. So this is a summary of services for this student. So they have support, special education support in reading, writing, behavior, and math. 282 minutes per week in each area. This student is in school for about 1,500 minutes per week, and in special education settings for about 1,100 minutes per week. So they're spending 26% of their time in a general education setting. And you can see they have different codes for the location of services. Schools must offer a range of placements for students. Okay, that ranges from general education environments, so fully inclusive settings, up to some very restrictive settings, things like hospital-based instruction, home-based instruction, residential schools, and those sorts of things. And there's things in between that too. So you've heard of resource rooms or self-contained classrooms. All of that needs to be on the table for kids. So this particular kid, so what's a C? A C is a special education setting. My guess is that's a resource room or a self-contained classroom. I'm not sure. This is the state of Washington. I've never practiced there. I don't know what their codes are. So that's the document. That's pretty much the document. And so again, I love the flow of special education law. It makes so much sense. Okay, you do an assessment, you gather some data, you write some PLAF statements. From the PLAF statements, you write some goals. Then you decide what services you need to meet those goals. And then you decide which placements needed to deliver the services. What schools usually do is start with placement though. And so the placements really should be the last thing you talk about, because you need to build it out from the PLAFs, the goals, the services to the placement. Anyways, this is an IEP. It's just an example. They all look kind of different, but they should all have those common or core elements to them. And so what I want you to do now is to either remember or refresh yourself on the Iris Center module, what they say, what good PLAF statements look like, what good goal statements look like, and what good services statements look like, and kind of take a look at this document and see if you can find some strengths and weaknesses with it. I don't really have preconceived notions about what your discussion is going to look like. I think there probably are some strengths and probably are some weaknesses. But I'm not going to say like, oh, you're wrong or something like that. So I just want to know what y'all think based on what you've learned so far about IEPs. And I think you have this link, but let me put the link for the Iris Center in the chat real quick too. Oops, I messed something up. Just so you have that. It is in Canvas, but I have it up here. Maybe. I'm going to stop sharing for a sec.
I have a question.
Sure.
So you described how like school, like IEP process is really straightforward. Like it's very, or not straightforward, but very logical in the sense that you do.
Yeah.
Sorry, that like you do the assessment, and then from the assessment you do the PLAFs, and then from the PLAFs you build the goals, and then but then like I'm in DVP, and so I have the experience sometimes where parents are coming to, so I interact with IEPs in a variety of ways, but one of the ways that I interact with them is that I have to help parents advocate, because I'm wondering if, like, how do you assure that the PLAFs that are being written about the child are based on assessments that are comprehensive and include, a variety of assessments?
Yeah, I mean, yes, that's an issue. That's an issue that schools need to attend to. And within IDEA, there's a number of provisions for evaluations, and IDEA says that assessments have to be multifaceted and comprehensive, and kids need to be evaluated in every area of suspected disability, even if it's not part of the eligibility criteria for that particular disability. So like say for a kid with sensory loss, so like a visual impairment, like the criteria for visual impairment say nothing about social skills, but social skills could very much be impacting that student in the classroom, and therefore the school should be assessing that area. And I think schools can get that part wrong sometimes, but reminding schools that they do have an obligation to do multifaceted and comprehensive evaluations would be helpful in many cases, I think. But that's kind of before that IEP meeting too, right? So it's kind of catching that part of it early. But that's a good question. and it can be a problem. So, Mike, can we break up to 4 groups?
Yep, got them ready to go.
Okay. Let me see if I need to remind everybody of anything first. So the link for the Iris Center modules in there, so I would pull that open. The stuff about PLAFs, goals, and service statements are on pages 6, 7, and 8, respectively. And so those are the ones you'll want to look at in reference to the IEP. But basically, I want you to talk about strengths and limitations of the document that you notice. And then we'll kind of come back to the large group and compare and contrast findings. I'm going to pop into each group and try to stay for about 4 or 5 minutes for each group too, in case you have any questions. All right, let's do it.
All right, here we go. Okay, everybody should be back.
All right, everyone, welcome back. I was able to get to each room, and so I heard some really good discussion, some things that I was thinking about when I looked through that document y'all were picking up on, and yeah, some really good kind of clarification questions as well. So I appreciate that. I wanted to come back to the large group because I wanted us to each hear from each other's groups about kind of major strengths and major limitations you saw. So I wonder if we could hear from each group kind of separately, I guess maybe one major strength and one major critique that you noticed from this document. And let's start with group 3 randomly. I don't remember who was.
I don't think we know which group we were.
Oh, we don't know. Okay, yeah. Oh, shoot.
All right, I can tell you. So group 1 is Ada, Ashley, Kaylee, and Sarah.
Well, we'll start with group 1 then.
All right, so a strength, I would say we wanted to see more of this, but we did like that they presented with her current level and her strength that she has in that specific area. Downfall though was the goal was very vague. It didn't really go into any specifics, the type of environment it would be in, or the time frame of when it would be completed. So like by the end of the year or by the end of October, like it didn't really go into specifics of that particular goal, or even show like how, like what she was going to do to get to that point. They just kind of stated what they wanted to see, and that was it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in the Iris Center module, they're laying out, a goal needs to be a SMART goal. And you probably all heard about SMART goals at some point in your training, right? But being specific, being measurable, having a time frame, having criteria for completion, those kind of things. Yeah, those didn't always seem to be present, or maybe they weren't present at all. I'm not sure, but yeah, thanks for sharing. I think I heard that, I picked up on that, and some other groups as well. So that sounds like maybe a common critique that's going to come through.
Real
Mike,
quick,
who's
I
in
think
group?
they did give the date it was going to be done by. It's just 2 boxes over. There's a box that says anticipated completion, and they do put a date in there. They just don't put it written out in their goal.
Yeah. The other thing you might, like in lots of IEPs, the goals are broken down as short-term objectives as well, and those can often have their own criteria and completion dates and such. And if completion dates aren't integrated into the document, you do know that the IEP is good for 1 year from its meeting date. So ultimately, the end date would be 1 year from the meeting. So, but those are good points, and thanks for pointing that out, Nicole. How about group 2? Who is group 2?
Group 2, Amelia, Allen, Heather, Crystal, and Madison.
I can go ahead and just talk about, so the method for evaluating progress, we talked a bit about it says data probes, and we thought maybe this needed to be more better described. One, for the purpose of the parents reading this, and then two, just looking at, the context of where the student would need to demonstrate the skills. So for example, the counting money, would they be doing that in a classroom setting, or would they be going out into to a grocery store or some social setting to show that they're able to reach that particular goal? So we thought it was a little vague, and then just needed a little more detail in terms of where they would be measuring that progress. We also didn't see where they put parents' input in terms of developing the IEP. We thought that was a necessary aspect of this particular transition plan. And then also, it does state a little bit about the student strengths, but maybe more depth within the present levels could have been included. I've seen present levels much longer and more detailed in terms of developing and indicating what that particular individual needs. So those were the limitations. It was the strengths were definitely limited overall, so it was hard to choose what to discuss there.
Yeah, you point out some really great things. I think, yeah, my read on data probes was that was like a teacher constructed test, which you see pretty regularly in IEPs, but there could have been a little more clarification around that. As school psychologists, so there's certain measures we like to see in there. School psychologists, we like a lot of like curriculum-based measurement, which has standardized, and there's technical properties to those measures and such. But yeah, that was quite vague. And then the strengths did seem to be more incorporated in the transition piece and not necessarily integrated into the PLAS statements like the Iris Center would recommend. So I think those were good things to pull out from there. Thank you. How about group 3?
It's Amelia Chapman, Callie, Emily, and Nicole.
Yeah, one of the things that we talked about maybe for like improvements was like the impact statements. I think the other group mentioned this, but they weren't super specific and almost seemed to be kind of copy and pasted. It impacts them at the 12th grade level, and their peers, are able to complete these skills. But maybe breaking down a little bit more what skills specifically they're struggling with and what that looks like for them. And we also talked about a kind of a strength was that they did talk about like specific accuracies and criterion for goals. And typically, they listed the level of like prompting. But another thing like that others mentioned was that, what setting that is in and is being tested in could be clarified a little bit more.
Yeah, those are great. So similar, limitations that y'all pulled out, but I do like that you noted those strengths of clarifying some things around the accuracy and the level of prompting as well. So those were quite specific. Well, there were some ranges, but fairly specific though. And then group 4.
All right, so we kind of went one by one on each of these, and you guys have covered the majority of the things that we've talked about that we didn't like. I won't lie, I don't think we really talked about any strengths because we pointed out a lot of things that need to be more specific. But one that we also looked at was that transition behavior box. And within that goal, it says the behavior will be monitored by an assigned school personnel and recorded in the student's progress notes data sheets over each grading period. We don't know who the school personnel is. It's not specific. Is it the same person each time? Are they trained the same way? Are they going to be looking for the same accuracies? Just trained properly if it is a different person. So it just doesn't give specifics on who this assigned personnel is and if it's going to be across multiple people. We also noticed that both like in the present levels for writing and reading, it was just a copy and paste. They were the exact same. And that also brought up just concerns on that matter.
Yeah, good. Thanks for expanding on. I think what a theme is there's some information that seems to be left out that would be needed in a lot of those elements. So like the PLAFs and the goals and being kind of vague, or folks wanting more specific information within each of those. So sort of the goal of this, so you kind of have, with the Iris Center module, you almost have some ammo now, right? Like you kind of know what these quality indicators are. You know how PLAFs should look and goals should look and what criteria they should meet. And my hope is that can kind of be helpful in your clinical work as you're helping the kids and adolescents and young adults that you're working with and their families, because many of you will end up reviewing IEPs to look at whether the services seem appropriate based on what your discipline does. And so my hope is that you can kind of apply those quality indicators with the folks that you're working with, and you have some more understanding of what should go into those documents, but doesn't always. So hopefully that was somewhat valuable to you. And then you get a chance to do this again kind of on your own with either another example, or if you can get your hands on an IEP or IFSP, which is for our birth to 3 population for one of your clients. You can apply those kind of quality indicators in those situations again and get some additional practice. I'm getting quite close on time. I have 3 minutes. So I don't know if anyone has any kind of final thoughts here. So this is my kind of last question for us. Maybe 1 or 2 people could think about this, but how can you integrate what you've learned about educational systems through completing this module in your future work, whether that's advocacy, clinical work, or research for folks with neurodevelopmental disabilities?
I'll chime in. Like this module has been really valuable for me because I think a big part of my job is reviewing IEPs for families and helping them break it down and helping them understand, and then also providing additional recommendations that the family can take back to the school as suggestions or things. And so learning, like orienting myself to the IEP, learning how these goals get written and the measurements are made, and then understanding the accommodations has been really helpful. I think for me, the big problem I continue to run into though is wondering if the assessments that were made that the IEP is built on were comprehensive in considering like all the elements that are at play for the child at school. So very valuable in learning how to read the IEPs though, and I'll use it a lot in my job.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that. And we should talk more about assessments too sometime, but we don't have time right now, but I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Great.
All right.
Well, obviously, like in my work, I do a lot of this already, but I know that part of what has come out, even like with the information from the IRIS module and advocacy work, really trying to figure out how to develop some better plain language kinds of resources for parents and even gen ed teachers. We've had this discussion recently as far as gen ed teachers will come to the IEP meeting and they really don't know sometimes a lot more than parents do. So trying to find some plain language or develop some resources for the gen ed teachers, the parents, as well as the students, so that they are familiar with what their plans and programs are and can advocate for themselves.
Yeah, I love that. You're working on that? Yeah, that's great. That's needed. Yeah, I agree with you about gen ed teachers too. And yeah, I'm not sure how much goes into pre-service training with respect to special ed law. It's been a minute since I've looked at that kind of curriculum, but you know, I think everyone needs to be on the same page in terms of what students' rights are and what families' rights are when we're talking about IDEA and Section 504. I mean, they're a big deal in school. So I love that. So, all right, I'm going to stop. It's time, right?
Yep, 7 on the dot, 7 o'clock.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. This was a lot of fun. I really like talking about this stuff. So please follow up if you have questions or want to continue the conversation in any way. And I'll be looking forward to reading your IEP critiques sometime this spring, and I'll get you some feedback and such. So take care. Be safe out there on the roads if it's icy where you are. It's pretty icy here in Mount Pleasant. So
Hey, Danny, I do have one question about the paper part. Do we
Sure.
need to submit the IEP with the paper as
no,
well?
please don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't need to worry about redacting information.
No,
I
no.
just
Yeah,
don't
I
put
don't
it in the
need to see
paper.
it.
Okay.
And if anyone is having trouble linking with being at an IEP or finding redacted documents, please let me or Danny know. I mean, reach out. We can help connect you to some resources.
Yeah, and there is one example that's already on Canvas that's linked that you can use. It's just another one from the same website that we looked at tonight. It's a adolescent with ASD, and it works just fine for this piece. But it'd be nice if it could be one of your the family you're working with or one of your clients or something like that if they're willing.
Can it be my son, because his IEP is due in, I think it's next month that I'm attending the meeting.
I think that would be fine. Let me think about it. I will get back to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Evaluation, you'll get an email, but I posted in the chat as well. So please help us out and complete that. And we will talk to you soon. Everyone have a good night.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Take care.